Hello, you are listening to an episode of Trade Talks, a podcast about the economics of trade policy. I am Samaya Keynes, economics and trade correspondent for The Economist in London.
And I'm Chad Bown, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington.
In this episode, we are going to talk about trade wars. President Donald Trump seems very keen on them.
You know, when we're behind on every single country, trade wars aren't so bad. You understand what I mean by that? When we're down by 30 billion, 40 billion, 60 billion, 100 billion, the trade war hurts them, doesn't hurt us. We're going to straighten it out, and we'll do it in a very loving way. It'll be a loving way.
I think it's fair to say that past trade wars really haven't been done in such a loving way. So in this episode, we'll be talking to Doug Irwin from Dartmouth College, my colleague here at the Peterson Institute. We're going to talk about the last big trade war that we had back in the 1930s. And we'll also talk about the right lessons to draw from that episode for today. Doug, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
The reason we're doing this episode is because a lot of people have been referring to the 1930s recently. But although they think they understand the 1930s and they think they know what happened, there's really a lot of common misunderstandings.
Okay, so I think the layman's version of the 1930s goes something like this. So there's this boogeyman. It's the Smoot-Hawley Tariff.
Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
To elaborate, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was this massive one-time increase in tariffs. It caused the Great Depression, made everything go wrong. It made other countries hit back with their own tariffs, and then the world just descended into a sort of economic hell. And it's that economic hell that some people are worried about returning to today with the president's new tariffs. So I think that's the version of the story that most people have in the back of their minds.
So let's go through this systematically. Okay, first, Doug, tell us, did the Smoot-Hawley Tariff cause the Great Depression, or did the Great Depression cause the Smoot-Hawley Tariff?
Those are two great questions, and the answer is neither. So let's look at the first one. Did the Great Depression cause the Smoot-Hawley Tariff? Nope, that's not the case because this idea of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff predates the Great Depression. It was first proposed in late 1928 by Republicans in the House of Representatives. It was passed by the House in May of 1929, before the business cycle peak, before the stock market crash, before we had really moved into the Great Depression. So then the question is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff cause the Great Depression? The answer there is also no. By the time it was finally passed through the Senate and signed by President Hoover, we were in a recession, but the tariffs themselves really didn't change the trajectory of the business cycle. We were moving already down. We just continued to move down. It didn't accelerate or anything like that.
Okay, but the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was a big increase in tariffs, right?
Well, here I'm going to give you the response of Sir Humphrey Appleby from the British show Yes, Minister, where he said, yes and no, Minister. So, yes, it was a big increase in tariffs. It was not an across-the-board increase, but it was very widespread. A lot of tariffs went up, over 800 products, I believe. But at the same time, we had done that before in the past without any Great Depression. Actually, the Republicans had done it in 1922. The big problem in the early 1930s is it wasn't just that the Congress increased the tariff rates, but deflation was pushing up tariff rates too, and this is sort of an odd cause for higher tariffs. But back then, about two-thirds of U.S. imports were covered by what are known as specific duties, which is a specific dollar amount per imported good. And so when prices go down, the burden of those specific tariffs goes up. And so a lot of the big increase in the tariffs, which reached almost 60% by 1932, was because of deflation in 1930, 31, and 32 as we were going down into the Great Depression.
Okay, so tariffs rose both because of the legislated increase, but also because of this deflation. What about the retaliation? Did America's trading partners hit back by raising their tariffs?
Yes, a number of countries did, and this was a very important part of the whole dynamic of the period. Canada, America's largest trading partners, raised tariffs against the United States twice in 1930. They were very upset by the loss of access to the U.S. market, and it was very disruptive for their economy, and politically they just couldn't get away with allowing the U.S. to get away with this without any response. The U.K. also raised its tariff at this time. It wasn't clear that it was in direct response to Smoot-Hawley. It may have been for domestic factors, but it was sort of started this dynamic. But Spain, Italy, others sort of pinpointed specific U.S. products, automobiles, sewing machines, for tariff increases sort of aimed at the U.S. because the U.S. is the major supplier of them. The Canadian retaliation was probably the most important because that was a big part of U.S. exports. And another problem at this time was that there's so much hostility in Europe and Latin America and Asia at the U.S. action that other countries sought to isolate the U.S., and they did so by forming trade blocs. So the most important one was that the Smoot-Hawley pushed the UK and Canada into a trade bloc with other former British colonies, and this was known as imperial preferences. And then in Asia, you got a trade bloc centered on Japan, which was also hit by the increase in U.S. silk duties and things of that sort. And so there was sort of this movement to isolate the U.S. and not deal with it anymore in terms of trade.
So I remember you telling us about the system of imperial preferences, the United Kingdom and its former colonies, back in our earlier Trade Talks episode 9, I think it was, when we were talking about the GATT. And the story there was, yes, Canada and Britain did increase tariffs a bit, but the bigger concern from the U.S. exporters' perspective was they lowered their tariffs toward each other. So all of a sudden now American wheat, American textile manufacturers just couldn't compete in those other markets because they faced tariffs that these other countries didn't.
Exactly. So there was widespread discrimination against the United States, raising tariffs on U.S. goods, cutting tariffs on within bloc trade. And so U.S. exporters really got thrown out of a lot of foreign markets, even if there wasn't direct retaliation against the U.S.
Okay, so that doesn't sound great for U.S. exporters, but it also doesn't really sound like a trade war. Tell us about the trade war.
Okay, so there was a trade war, indeed a massive trade war in the early 1930s. It wasn't necessarily caused by Smoot-Hawley. Now, Smoot-Hawley did lead to retaliation against the U.S. and isolation against the U.S. trade. But the big sort of worldwide conflagration came in 1931 and 32, and the real problem there was macroeconomic, and it centered on the gold standard, which was really one of the key problems during this period in economic history. So the issue with the gold standard is that all countries tied the value of their currency to how much gold reserves they had in their central bank vaults. And for various reasons, there was a shortage of gold during this period, and that put countries under deflationary pressures. And when prices are falling, it creates difficult times in terms of the macroeconomy. And so countries were scrambling to increase their holdings of gold. And one way of doing that is by limiting gold outflows or by trying to rig a balance of trade surplus so that you have an inflow of gold. And so what that meant is that countries were imposing all sorts of restrictions on imports to limit spending on imports to hoard the gold that they had. And this is what really spiraled out of control, really starting in 1931, when there was a financial crisis first in Austria and Germany, and they imposed exchange controls. They wouldn't allow gold to leave the country anymore. And then Britain went off the gold standard in September of 1931. That led other countries to try to prevent gold from flowing outward to Britain. They imposed exchange controls as well. And you sort of got this spiral of more and more countries layering on, really for balance of payments reasons, restrictions on trade.
So the issue is that when you import, you need to pay for those imports with gold, and that means that you lose gold, and that interferes with your objective of trying to hoard gold reserves.
Exactly. So many countries were doing this, and what happened when Britain went off the gold standard is not just did they started attracting gold from other countries, which other countries wanted to prevent through trade barriers, but they also gave British manufacturers a competitive advantage on the world markets because the price of British goods was now cheaper. And so that led to yet another round of retaliation against Britain in terms of surcharges that countries would put on British goods and Commonwealth goods because their prices were now lower. So really, in some sense, this is as much a currency war as it is a trade war. But of course, the two are interrelated. If some countries are upset with the balance of payments policies of one country, they layer on trade restrictions and exchange controls, and it just spins out of control.
So exchange controls. So you're making it sound like a lot of the retaliation that was taking place in the 1930s really wasn't all necessarily coming through tariffs. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so this is about the broadest array of trade weapons that a country can deploy. It wasn't just tariffs, it was import quotas, which are quantitative restrictions on the volume of imports. But exchange controls, foreign exchange controls, are probably even worse than tariffs or quotas because you can't import if you can't have access to foreign exchange. And governments were allocating foreign exchange to purposes that they wanted to and really limiting the ability of private businesses and consumers to get access to foreign exchange. So it really doesn't matter what the tariff or the quota is. If you can't even get the foreign exchange to buy foreign goods, that's really a major trade restriction. So world trade was really being strangled, not just by explicit trade barriers, but by the exchange controls that were limiting access to foreign currency. And so one way around foreign exchange controls was actually barter arrangements. And so that's when you saw governments and private sector groups engaging in barter between trades, so you didn't have to use foreign exchange at all. So in 1932, for example, 29,000 Hungarian pigs were exchanged for 20,000 wagons of Czech wooden fuel. And once again, that's just to avoid the use of currency. So when you push trade towards barter, it becomes very inefficient. In 1933, there was a treaty between Britain and Denmark that ensured the UK would import a certain amount of bacon from Denmark in exchange for a certain amount of British coal. So you're really sort of demonetizing the whole world trading system, and you're getting to this exchange of one product for another in these barter arrangements.
So when I think about this all sounds quite comforting. If I think about these two kinds of trade tensions, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff and this kind of massive macroeconomic war that countries seem to be waging in the 1930s, today, President Donald Trump's actions seem much closer to the first kind, where there was some retaliation, but it was limited in scope. It didn't lead to the collapse of the international trading system. Should I be comforted?
So we're in a very different situation today. We don't have the gold standard. We have independent central banks. We have flexible exchange rates. And so that means in terms of the macroeconomic situation, national governments have the ability to sort of stabilize their economies, and we won't get into this beggar thy neighbor war over gold reserves. And so I don't think that the world trading system will collapse quite in the way we saw in the 1930s. We are going to get these trade skirmishes, however, the more the Trump administration imposes sectoral trade measures that other countries feel they have to respond to.
Yeah. So that being said, I don't feel particularly comforted at the moment. So in response to the steel and aluminum tariffs, we've already seen the European Union announce their plan to rebalance their trading relationship with the United States, a limited retaliation, but they're already stating what they're going to retaliate over in terms of bourbon and cranberries and Harley-Davidson motorcycles, products like that. And in China, after the Trump administration imposed those tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, they started an anti-dumping case on sorghum from the United States and may potentially eliminate $1 billion worth of exports there. So we are likely to see some retaliation coming up.
Absolutely. And that's where the Smoot-Hawley analogy kicks in. So what Trump has done so far is not like Smoot-Hawley in the sense that there's not sort of across-the-board tariff increases, but in terms of these particular sectoral measures, there will be a retaliatory response, and it will be economically damaging. So there's this wonderful quote from the EU President Jean-Claude Juncker, who said, basically, we are obligated to retaliate. He said, so now we have to also impose import tariffs. This is basically a stupid process, the fact that we have to do this, but we have to do it. We will now impose tariffs on motorcycles, Harley-Davidson, on blue jeans, Levi's, on bourbon. We can also do stupid. We also have to be this stupid. So that's the sort of the retaliatory dynamic that other countries are not going to let the U.S. get away with this, and they're going to have to respond.
And history could also repeat itself when it comes to America being cut out of trade deals that other countries are forming, just like the British imperial preferences of the 1930s. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP that President Trump pulled the United States out of, well, that's going forward with the 11 other countries. American cattle ranchers and beef producers are now shut out of the Japanese market, and so that means Australian beef can get in there at a much lower tariff, and the Americans can't compete. Or that Canada-European Union trade agreement. Lobstermen and women in Maine are now finding it increasingly difficult to export their crustaceans to the EU because Canada now has a lower tariff getting into the EU market than they do.
Okay, so that doesn't sound great, but it still doesn't sound as alarming as what happened in the 1930s when, global trade volumes just fell off a cliff. And in terms of the retaliation, again, the EU at least looks like they'll be limited in their response. The one thing that I'm a bit worried about can be seen on the president's Twitter feed when he said that he seems to want to retaliate against the EU's retaliation. There's this idea that's been reported that he wants reciprocal tariffs, where he would raise American tariffs to an equal level of whatever the other countries' tariffs were. And that kind of seems to be egging on other countries to retaliate and taking trade policy back quite a few decades.
Yes, the way the trade skirmishes in the past have worked is that the U.S. or some country imposes some duties, other countries retaliate, and usually there's a ceasefire after that. But unfortunately, President Trump doesn't seem to want to have a ceasefire. He wants to continue down this road. He wants to continue to escalate. And that, of course, can create big, big problems down the road. So, for example, if Trump decides to respond to the European retaliation by saying, well, we are going to rebalance and have reciprocal tariffs on automobiles because the EU tariff on automobiles is higher than the U.S. tariff, well, then the Europeans can say you also have much higher tariffs on imported trucks than we, the Europeans, do, and we're going to rebalance that. First of all, you're cherry-picking which sectors tariffs are working against you, and then you sort of move forward with higher tariffs that other countries are forced to respond to. And that can quickly spin out of control.
And I guess the force that would stop that from happening would be the way that American trade law is set up. So I think there have also been reports that Donald Trump wants a bill to give him the power to unilaterally raise tariffs on, say, European cars. And I think it's fairly unlikely that Congress will give him that power. And so in order to do that, he would have to start using fairly extreme parts of American law, claiming some kind of national emergency. Only that would let him do this kind of thing that he seems to want to do.
We aren't yet at the stage of countries not being able to exchange currency until they have to trade pigs for firewood.
And when that happens, I think we're going to need a Trade Talks episode about it. So everyone should stay tuned. That is all from Trade Talks.
Thanks again to Doug Irwin, the professor of economics at Dartmouth College and a colleague of mine here at the Peterson Institute. For more from Doug on the topics we talked about today, he's a couple of books. And these books are actually a little bit shorter than his other books. So one is called Trade Policy Disaster, Lessons from the 1930s. And a second is called Peddling Protectionism, Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression.
Huge thanks to Doug, and we will tweet out links to his books on Twitter. And so please do tell everyone you know how great this podcast is and that they should definitely listen to it. You can tell them on all the social media channels as well. I hear that Facebook is a popular one these days, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, all of them. And if you have any feedback or praise, then do get in touch. On Twitter, I am at Samaya Keynes.
And I'm at Chad Bown.
And we're on at trade__talks.
That's not one but two underscores, at trade__talks.
Because when it comes to trade wars, we are hoping that one major episode in history really was enough.